In November 1994, the Old Flying Machine Company acquired an ex-Polish Air Force MiG-15. This two-seat version of the Mikoyan-Gurevich Design Bureau's first classic jet was one of the stars of the 1995 display season.
I always liked the idea of Russian jet fighters, but really what spurred us on to look for a MiG-15 or 17 was the fact that we had Golden Apple Trust's Sabre. We were operating that aeroplane, and it seemed that with our Messerschmitt Spitfire dogfight that we'd been doing for years, it would be a good thing to do a Korean War MiG Sabre dogfight as well. And that's kind of how it evolved. You know, it's a desire to fly an interesting aeroplane, and two, it's obviously something that is also interesting to airshow organisers.
Rolf Meum, a Norwegian pilot, was to be the main display pilot for the MiG in 1995. Once the youngest fighter pilot in NATO, he'd never flown a MiG until last year. So how do you prepare for such a classic jet?
We do have Polish and Chinese manuals for the airplane, which have been technically translated. And the process to fly the airplane is, first you have to get evaluated by the Civil Aviation Authority. They have to check your background and approve a training scheme for you to fly the airplane. And from then on, it's a lot of self-study, a lot of talks with engineers, a lot of sitting around in the airplane, getting to know all the switches and all the systems, how they work. Next thing is to get a proper briefing on how it works, and then digest that, and then, you know, a brush up before you go fly it the first time. And it all sort of happens within a few weeks, so you concentrate very much on that airplane.
What then were his first impressions of the aircraft?
The first flight it's always exciting. It's everything in the cockpit is quite different in layout and philosophy compared to what I'm used to from the military and some of the other old jets I've flown. And everything is sort of new, so you're sort of like very attentive to everything that goes on, as you should be. And as everything is a bit different from what you're used to, you tend to sort of, you know, really check up on things all the time. But the flight itself was absolutely wonderful. It's a very nice flying airplane. I had the first flight without the drop tanks on, which improves the airplane handling characteristics quite a lot. And the only bad part about it, you only got 20 minutes of endurance because of limited fuel.
This particular MiG was built in 1955 in Czechoslovakia, but converted to two-seat configuration. It was in service with the Polish Air Force until as late as 1992.
This particular airplane has got an interesting history. It's not a dual-controlled. It's not a training airplane. It was specially converted to act as a forward air control aircraft, both for other ground attack fighters and also for artillery. And the back seat is full of navigation gear and camera control gear. And the back seater would basically spot targets, either take pictures or hang around in the sort of battlefield area and call in artillery and fighters. And it's one of, I think, only 6 or 8 that the Poles converted to operate like that.
The crew concept that had been part of the aircraft's military service was duly carried over to its display flying, with Wayne Fuller from the Old Flying Machine Company occupying the rear crew position.
My responsibility in the back seat of the airplane was a second pair of eyes and hands for Rolf. I can see a lot of things from the back of the airplane which during the display Rolf cannot see, such as the datum point and looking back down the aircraft, and I will call also the speeds and the height to Rolf while we're displaying, so Rolf's eyes can stay continually outside the cockpit, therefore making it a much safer operating environment.
So what does a trip in the MiG feel like from the back seat?
It's a lot of fun. It's a very privileged position to be in, and it is a very enjoyable airplane to fly. It's very comfortable and a very relaxing way to travel.
When the MiG-15 first appeared, it shocked the West, whose technology was still heavily dependent on piston-engined aircraft. It wasn't until the F-86 Sabre arrived that the balance was redressed. Rolf has flown both the advanced piston-engined aircraft and the MiG.
My overall impression is it's a very, very nice airplane. It has, you know, about the highest performance of any jet of that era, which was displayed quite clearly in the Korean conflict back in 1950 when the MiGs first started showing up on the arena, where they outclassed any of the Allied airplanes until the F-86 Sabre came in. And even the F-86 Sabre comes up short in certain situations with the MiG. Well, the maximum ceiling of the airplane is 51,000 feet, which actually exceeds what the Sabre was capable at the time. And it has a maximum speed, true airspeed, of around 670 miles an hour. Having been fortunate to fly many of the old Flying Machine Company piston airplanes like the Mustang, Spitfire, the Sea Fury and Corsair, obviously the Sea Fury and the Corsair were actually in combat with the MiG-15 in Korea, and both of them also shot down MiGs and were shot down by MiGs. The difference in technology and performance is such a quantum leap that there really, until you got into the super fighters like the late F-16s and F-15s and such, where you have more thrust to weight ratio than anything, there's never been such a quantum leap in performance. And you know, people were just parking the Mustang one day and the next week they were flying in airplanes like this, or the Lavochkins and into the MiGs. And the first thing that strikes you is how quiet and how smooth everything is. After having that big reciprocal engine banging away in front of you for so many hours or years, then getting into this quiet, air-conditioned environment with speed way beyond belief of what you've ever been close to in pistons. It must have been sort of like a Flash Gordon experience for many.
The old Flying Machine Company had already been operating a T-33 and the F-86 Sabre. They encountered some problems in their first season with the MiG.
There's a lot of differences between Eastern European airplanes and Western airplanes, and undoubtedly starting to fly it and operate it this year, we have run across some minor operating snags, not technical snags. The airplanes actually performed very well, but for example, its batteries are weak, okay, and it requires a ground power unit to start it. But it requires a very specific type of ground power unit, and one of the problems we've had with air shows is that despite the fact that we've told them we need such and such a type, and we've always pre-noted people of this, we find on arrival that they assume that an F-16 ground power unit or a Tornado ground power unit must be able to start the MiG, but it won't. The actual flying of the airplane and operating of the airplane has been no problem at all. It's a very simple, straightforward, reliable aircraft. I'm very happy with it from that point of view. I feel, truthfully, that this last year it's seen its debut, but it still hasn't properly manifested itself in its sort of full capabilities and capacity. But we've had an awful lot of interest in it, and when it has flown at shows, very, very favourable response. Actually, we've had very favourable response to all of our jet displays, but the MiG, because it's the only one flying in the whole of Western Europe, and it's really a first, it has met with a great deal of interest.
You start the takeoff roll with a stick full forward, because the center of gravity is quite far off on takeoff, and the acceleration, initial acceleration, will actually lift the nose on the airplane, which is a quite unusual sensation. So you start the takeoff with a stick well forward, keep the nose down and keep the angle of attack down to a minimum. Then you get a more positive rotation when you want to take the airplane off. Once it's airborne at 115 knots, you arm the undercarriage, safety catch away, and you get the gear up. And passing through 150 knots, you take up 20 degrees of flap, which you always use for takeoff. The airplane then wants to settle. It's a bit tail heavy, even with the takeoff trim set where it should be. And then as it accelerates, you get more and more feel for the airplane. The trim actually comes more and more into range as the speed increases. Usually the airplane would pitch up more and more as speed increases, but it doesn't do so in this MiG, which is also a bit of an unusual trait. And off you go. Best climb speed is 340 knots, which is quite quick. Rate of climb, the way we operate it, is usually around 5,500 feet per minute, which is a quite high rate. But obviously we never take it up to the maximum limits of what the airplane can handle, because we're usually at an air display somewhere, or we throttle it back for cruising to get range out of it. The airplane has manual flight controls with push rods. The ailerons also have a hydraulic boost setup, which takes a lot of the load off the ailerons. The airplane has a decent roll rate, but when you get drop tanks on it, they actually cushion out the roll rate quite noticeably. And although the ailerons are very sensitive and you have very positive response on ailerons at all time, you get quite a noticeable cushioning effect on the roll rate when you go full deflection. The elevator is very nice and sensitive. It's got positive stability, dynamic and static, and it's a very effective elevator on it. And you can really utilize the whole maneuvering potential of the airplane in pitch. When it comes to the rudder, it has a very large fin, and that has a word of caution. This airplane has a stability problem. The two-seat with the big canopy probably worse than the single-seater, but at speeds up in the region of 380 knots and above, you really get into a little bit of a tail snaking. Nothing that can't be controlled. But if you continue increasing speed, there's a big warning that once you come up to about 545 knots, you will get uncommanded pitch and roll inputs and a rudder reversal and basically lose control of the airplane. And this obviously due to compressibility as you approach the speed of sound. It's about 0.92 Mach. And this comes from the aerodynamics at the time. It's a fairly thick laminar flow wing, and it will, at one stage, a thick wing runs into compressibility, and that's what it's doing. The airplane, you slow it down to about 180 knots on downwind, you get your gear and the flaps down. You turn finals at about 160 knots, and on final you hold about 145 knots. That's the recommended book figure. Here at Duxford, which is short, we start reducing that so as to cross the threshold at about 125 knots if it's a very calm, nice day, and you add about 10 knots if it's a little bit of wind, simply because it starts getting into a yawing situation, almost something similar to a Dutch roll, although it's very easy to control with just small rudder inputs. You want to be on the safe side. You have about 10 knots extra if there's any turbulence around. Once you put it on the ground, you cannot do a full flare-out stall landing in this airplane. It's supposed to be flown onto the runway. The reason is you will actually hit the ground with the tail of the airplane before you reach a stalling angle of attack. So you put it on the ground, immediately lower the nose wheel and just touch the brakes to see that they work, and then depending on your runway length, here at Duxford you get on the brakes right away and you just stay on them until you stop.